For years, game designers were told one thing: players don't like being confused. That if you drop someone into a world without a minimap, a tutorial pop-up, or a friendly voice explaining exactly what to do next, they'll bounce, they'll get frustrated, they'll stop playing. So games adapted. Objectives became louder, interfaces became busier. Failure became something to smooth over rather than confront. And then Dark Souls arrived and ignored almost all of that. It didn't explain its systems in any meaningful way. It didn't care if you understood its story. It barely even acknowledged your existence beyond the simple fact that you are now here. And survival was your responsibility. By every traditional rule of modern game design, Dark Souls should have failed. Instead, it reshaped an entire generation of games. Because Dark Souls didn't treat confusion as a problem to solve, it treated it as an emotional state worth designing around. When you step into Lordran for the first time, you're not overwhelmed by exposition, you're overwhelmed by silence. No quest log, no clear direction, just enemies that kill you quickly and a world that refuses to slow down long enough to explain itself. And that confusion does something interesting. It forces you to pay attention, to observe, to experiment. To learn not because the game tells you to, but because you want to survive. This is the moment where Dark Souls quietly breaks from its peers. Not by being cruel, or inaccessible, or intentionally obtuse, but by trusting the player to meet it halfway. It assumes you're capable of learning through failure, capable of reading spaces instead of icons, capable of discovering meaning without having it explicitly laid out. And that assumption, more than its difficulty, more than its combat, more than its lore, is what changed modern game design. Because once Dark Souls proved that players didn't just tolerate this approach, but embraced it, the industry had to reconsider a question it thought was already answered. What if players don't need less friction? What if they need better reasons to push through it? And if you're enjoying this video, subscribing helps me keep making more like this. Difficulty is usually treated like a settings menu problem. Too hard, lower the damage. Too easy, inflate enemy health. Failure, in most games, is an inconvenience, something to be minimized, softened, or quietly removed so the player can get back to the real content. Dark Souls doesn't do that. In Dark Souls, difficulty isn't an obstacle in the way of the experience. It is the experience. Every enemy can kill you, every mistake costs something, and every death is framed not as a punishment. But as information, the game never tells you this outright, of course. It doesn't need to. You learn it the hard way, through repeated failure, through frustration, through the slow realization that the problem usually isn't the numbers, it's you, your timing, your positioning, your impatience, and this is where Dark Souls quietly separates itself from the games that came before it. Because difficulty here isn't about reaction speed or mechanical mastery alone. It's about decision-making, about understanding when to attack, when to retreat, when to be cautious, and when greed will get you killed. Every encounter asks a question, and every death is the game saying, that wasn't the answer. What makes this design so unusual isn't just that it's hard, it's that the game refuses to cushion the consequences. When you die, you lose your souls, your progress, your sense of momentum, and suddenly survival isn't abstract anymore. It's personal. You felt that loss, so you adapt. This creates a feedback loop most modern games avoid. Instead of shielding the player from frustration, Dark Souls uses frustration as a teaching tool, not in a sadistic way, but in a deliberate one, because the game is remarkably fair. Enemies telegraph their attacks. Stamina behaves consistently. Bosses follow rules, even when they feel overwhelming. Once you understand those rules, the difficulty doesn't disappear, but it becomes readable, predictable, almost conversational. And that's when something interesting happens. You stop asking, why is this so hard? And start asking, what am I doing wrong? That shift in mindset is crucial. Most games are designed to make you feel powerful as quickly as possible. Dark Souls delays that gratification, not to deny you power, but to redefine it. Power doesn't come from higher numbers or better gear alone. It comes from knowledge, from restraint, from learning when not to act. This is why so many players describe their breakthrough moments in Dark Souls not as victories, but as realizations. The moment you stop panic rolling, the moment you stop button mashing, the moment you realize that patience is a weapon. And once you internalize that lesson, it doesn't stay confined to Dark Souls. something to balance around accessibility. It became something to design with intent. Games began to ask harder questions of players, not because difficulty was trendy, but because Dark Souls proved something radical. Players don't need to be protected from failure. They need failure to mean something. And that idea, that difficulty can teach rather than punish, became one of Dark Souls' most enduring contributions to modern game design. Once Dark Souls establishes that failure is part of the learning process, it takes the next step. It removes the teacher. There are no pop-ups explaining enemy placement, no mini-maps highlighting optimal routes, no quest log quietly reminding you where you should be. Instead, Dark Souls teaches through architecture. Lordran is designed less like a series of levels and more like a physical place, one that expects you to observe it, remember it, and eventually understand it. Every path, every staircase, every narrow corridor is communicating something, whether you're listening or not. This is where Dark Souls differs from most modern games. In many open worlds, space exists to be traversed. In Dark Souls, space exists to be interpreted. The world doesn't guide you forward. It asks you to read the situation and decide whether moving forward is a good idea in the first place. Enemy placement is the most immediate example. A lone enemy in a wide area feels like an invitation. A tight hallway with multiple foes feels like a warning. A quiet room, conspicuously empty, almost always signals danger. Not because the game told you so, but because it's trained you to be suspicious. These are lessons learned through repetition, not instruction. And then there's verticality. Lordran folds over itself in ways that are initially disorienting, then slowly revelatory. Elevation isn't decoration, it's communication. Ladders expose vulnerability. Narrow ledges create tension. High ground offers safety but limits movement. The world teaches you how to move through it simply by existing the way it does. This becomes most obvious when shortcuts begin to reveal themselves. Opening a locked gate and realizing it leads back to a familiar bonfire isn't just a convenience, it's a moment of spatial clarity. You suddenly understand how areas relate to one another. The world stops feeling hostile and starts feeling legible. You didn't follow a marker to get there. You earned that understanding. And once you have it, navigation changes entirely. You stop relying on memory aids and start relying on memory. You recognize landmarks, you anticipate ambush points. You develop routes, safe ones, risky ones, efficient ones. The world becomes something you inhabit, not something you pass through. Bonfires reinforce this rhythm. Placed deliberately far apart, they divide the world into stretches of risk and relief. Each bonfire feels like a negotiation. Push forward and learn something new, or retreat and protect what you've earned. The world never tells you which option is correct. It simply allows you to make the choice and live with it. What's striking about all of this is how little Dark Souls needs to explain. There's no tooltip telling you that the world is interconnected, no message congratulating you for understanding its layout. The game assumes that if you care enough to notice, the lesson will land. And for many players, it does. This design philosophy ripples outward. Modern games increasingly rely on environmental cues, subtle guidance, and diegetic storytelling. Not because Dark Souls invented these ideas, but because it proved they could sustain an entire game without collapsing under player confusion. It showed that clarity doesn't have to come from the interface. It can come from the world itself. In Dark Souls, the environment isn't just where the game happens. It's how the game speaks, and it speaks quietly to players willing to listen. By most design standards, death is a problem to be solved. It interrupts momentum. It frustrates players. It risks pushing people away, so modern games do everything they can to soften it. Instant reloads, minimal penalties, a gentle nudge back onto the path as if nothing important happened. Dark Souls does the opposite. When you die, the game makes sure you feel it. You drop your souls, the currency tied to your level, your power, your progress. Not permanently, not immediately, but conditionally. They sit there, waiting, daring you to come back and earn them. This single decision changes everything. Because now death isn't just failure, it's a question. Do you go back for what you lost? Do you risk another run through hostile territory? Do you push forward, knowing one mistake wipes everything away? Suddenly, every choice carries weight. This is where tension comes from in Dark Souls, not from scripted moments or dramatic set pieces, but from self-imposed stakes. You care because the game lets you care. It never forces the risk. It just allows it to exist. Corpse runs become psychological tests. You retrace your steps, heart rate slightly elevated, replaying the mistake that killed you last time. You move slower, you pay attention, you don't rush, because rushing is how you ended up here in the first place. And if you succeed, the relief is real. If you fail again, the loss is absolute. What's important is that the game never judges you either way. There's no game over screen dripping with shame, no reminder that you failed the designer's expectations. The world simply continues, indifferent, waiting for you to adapt. This is why death in Dark Souls feels fair, even when it's brutal. The rules are consistent, the consequences are clear, and the responsibility is entirely yours. Over time, this reshapes how you play. You stop chasing reckless victories. You stop overextending for one more hit. You start valuing survival over speed, not because the game told you to, but because experience taught you to, and something subtle happens alongside this shift. Patience becomes a skill. In many games, impatience is rarely punished. You can brute force encounters, heal through mistakes, rely on systems to catch you when you fall. Dark Souls removes those safety nets, not to frustrate you, but to teach you restraint. You learn when to disengage, when to retreat, when not to fight. This is why death works here. It isn't a reset, it's feedback, immediate, honest, and difficult to ignore. And once you internalize that, it doesn't stay confined to Dark Souls. Players begin approaching other games differently. They read encounters more carefully. They respect enemy placement. They expect consequences. The design philosophy bleeds outward, shaping expectations long after the game is over. Dark Souls didn't invent death penalties. What it did was give death meaning again. It reminded designers that loss can be motivating, that tension doesn't need spectacle, and that players are willing to accept harsh consequences. If those consequences feel earned, death works in Dark Souls because it completes the conversation the game is having with the player. You make a decision, the world responds, and you learn, or you don't. Either way, the game never intervenes. When Dark Souls released, it didn't immediately rewrite the industry. There was no overnight shift, no sudden flood of minimalist interfaces or cryptic storytelling across every genre. What it did instead was slower and far more influential. It changed what designers believed players would tolerate, and more importantly, what they would value. Difficulty was often framed as a barrier, something to sand down, automate, or quietly remove in the name of accessibility. After it, difficulty became something designers could justify, not as punishment, but as structure. We started seeing games that trusted the player again, level design that taught through space instead of text, combat systems that expected observation, not button mashing, worlds that refused to pause and explain themselves, not because they were copying Dark Souls outright, but because FromSoftware had proven that this philosophy worked. You can see it in the rise of the so-called soulslike, of course, games that borrow stamina management, checkpoint placement, and risk-reward death systems. But the more interesting influence is quieter. It's in games that aren't hard for the sake of being hard, but deliberate. Games that allow failure to linger. Games that stop rescuing the player from their own decisions, even outside of combat-driven design. Dark Souls shifted expectations around storytelling. It showed that narrative doesn't need to be front-loaded to be effective. That ambiguity can be an invitation, not a flaw. That players will piece together meaning on their own, and often feel more connected because of it. This wasn't a rejection of accessibility. It was a rejection of over-explanation, and that distinction matters. Dark Souls didn't argue that games should be opaque or hostile. It argued that players don't need to be constantly reassured. That struggle can be part of immersion. That discovery feels better when it's earned. In the years since, the industry hasn't moved entirely in one direction or the other, and that's a good thing. Not every game should be Dark Souls. Not every experience benefits from friction, but the conversation changed. Designers stopped asking, "Will this frustrate players?" and started asking, "Is this frustration meaningful?" That shift, subtle, philosophical, and hard to quantify, is Dark Souls' real legacy. Not a genre, not a difficulty trend, but a renewed trust in the player. Dark Souls isn't important because it's difficult. It's important because it treats the player as capable of learning without tutorials, capable of understanding space without markers, capable of enduring loss and finding motivation in it. It doesn't chase engagement metrics or comfort curves. It asks something of you and waits patiently for you to respond. And that's why, years later, it still feels distinct. Not because other games failed to copy it, but because so few were willing to adopt the same confidence in trusting the player. Dark Souls changed what modern game design thought was possible, and it did so quietly, one death at a time.